Yosemite, California, one of the most stunningly beautiful places on Earth, and the backdrop to one of the darkest, most horrific family stories of two brothers. One who was kidnapped for 7 years, the other who would become a serial killer.
Bawling, because there was just so many eyes on the story.
Steven Stayner was in school today here at Merced Union High School, but his mother says she doesn't want anybody interviewing him anymore while he's in class.
Once he started school in 9th grade, they followed him. They wanted to.
Welcome to True Crime Legacy, the podcast exploring the generational impacts of horrific crimes. I'm your host, Eagle. Today we're diving into the unfathomable story of the Steiner family, who endured not one, but two nightmarish tragedies that made headlines across America. This almost unbelievable saga begins in the early 1970s in Merced, California, where Del and Cary Stayner were raising their 5 children: Steven, Cary, Cindy, Shelly and Shannon. The all-American family enjoyed a peaceful life in the Central Valley, until one December day when 7-year-old Steven disappeared on his walk home from school. Despite a desperate search, there was no trace of the boy. Years ticked by with no breaks in the case. Then incredibly, when Steven was 14, he suddenly reappeared, escaping from the clutches of a pedophilic kidnapper who had held him captive for over 7 years. Steven's homecoming sparked a media frenzy. But the family's joy soon gave way to the grim realization that their son had been severely traumatized. And their emotional scars were only beginning. A decade after gaining one son back, they would lose the other, when Cary was revealed to be a serial killer and sentenced to death. This story of the Stainers is one of shifting sympathies. Of a family broken apart and stitched back together, only to come undone once more in horrific fashion. Join me as we untangle the thread of this American tragedy. December 4th, 1972. A chilly winter afternoon in Merced. Outside Charles Wright Elementary, students bundled in puffy coats flood through the gates at the 3 o'clock bell. Among them is 7-year-old Steven Stayner, walking home alone as usual. He heads east down North Highway 59, passing stores and restaurants toward the outskirts of town. But Steven doesn't make it home that day. And he won't for another 7 years. Somewhere along his route, the brown-haired second grader encounters a man calling himself Reverend Edwards. This Reverend says he's collecting donations for his church. He asks Steven if he'd like a ride. The boy accepts. But when Steven climbs into the car, he realizes Edwards is not alone. In the passenger seat is a man in his 30s, Irvin Edward Murphy. Murphy tells the trusting child they intend to drive him home. Instead, they travel 85 miles northwest, into the ominous darkness of the Coast Ranges. At an isolated cabin, they hand the boy off to a third man, convicted pedophile Kenneth Parnell. This predator wastes no time indoctrinating his victim with lies, telling Steven his parents no longer want him, but he will care for the boy as his own son. And so begins Steven Stayner's 7-year odyssey in captivity. Passed between small NorCal towns like a phantom. Forced to hide in plain sight, just another anonymous face. Docile and fearful on the outside, while rage and panic grow within. Over the next 7 years, Kenneth Parnell assumes a sinister father figure role over young Steven. To conceal his crime, he renames the boy Dennis Parnell and poses as his dad. They drift between residences around California's Mendocino County, with Parnell enrolling Steven in various schools. Classmates remember the boy they knew as Dennis as a popular, outgoing kid who showed no external signs of distress. But at night, alone with Parnell, Steven endures sexual abuse from his captor. As he grows older, the trauma leaves deep scars. In public, Dennis appears carefree. At home, Steven silently suffers. Parnell eventually secures a false birth certificate to back up his deception. Steven, now believing his real parents have rejected him, feels hopelessly trapped. Even as missing child posters with Steven's photos circulate nearby, the kidnapped boy stays silent, fearing Parnell's threats of retaliation. For years, leads in Steven's case grow cold. Then in February 1980 comes a break. Not in the search for Steven Stayner, but for another missing boy named Timothy White. On February 14, 1980, Valentine's Day, 5-year-old Timmy vanishes outside his school in Ukiah, California. A concerned neighbor witnesses 2 men pulling Timmy into a car. She notes the license plate, planning to report it. But the witness hesitates, not wanting to cause trouble if it was the boy's family. Her delay proves critical. By the next day, Timmy has disappeared without a trace. In fact, he has been abducted by the same man who took Steve and Kenneth Parnell. And Parnell has moved fast to cover his tracks. With an accomplice named Sean Porman, Parnell dyes Timmy's hair, gives him a new name, and stashes him at a remote cabin. There, Timmy joins 14-year-old Steven, still living under Parnell's abusive control years after his own abduction. Horrified at Parnell's intentions for the younger boy, Steven decides he must act. On March 1, 1980, Steven seizes an opportunity. With Parnell away, Steven sneaks out of the cabin with Timmy in tow. They hitchhike 40 miles to the town of Ukiah, dropping Timmy at a police station. The terrified boy mumbles his real name, bringing a sudden break in his case. Police contact Steven, still using the name Dennis Parnell. He pretends Timmy is a younger relative he discovered Parnell kidnapping, providing enough vague details to spur an arrest. Within hours, authorities apprehend Kenneth Parnell and return Timmy to his distraught but relieved family.
Town of Ukiah.
It's dark, and Timmy can't remember where he lives. So Steven figures the best thing to do is to take him to the police station.
Keep in mind, Steve Stayner was known as Dennis for 7 long years. But when he arrives at that police station, he says something that will be embedded in the public consciousness forever.
I know my first name is Steven.
Merced triumphant.
Steven's return has been a joyous event.
Within days, he's on Good Morning America.
Good morning, Steven and Mr. and Mrs. Stayner. And Steven, how does it feel to be home?
Feels great.
Did you remember your parents well?
They didn't change that much. I recognized them when I got out of the car.
What about your brothers and sisters?
They changed a lot. I never recognized either one of them.
Mr. and Miss Stayner, how did this affect your other 4 children?
Only after Parnell is in custody does Steven reveal the whole truth. In a stunning turn, he discloses that 7 years ago, Parnell kidnapped him too.
When you were walking home from school?
Yes, I was walking home from school, and I was stopped by a man along the street just a few blocks from my house. And he asked me if I wanted to, me or my mother wanted to donate something to a church. And I had told him that my mother would probably want to. And so he offered me a ride home. I had refused the first time, telling him that my house is just a few blocks away. And he had asked me several more times, and after a while I had taken the ride. Car pulled up, and I got in, and they passed the road that I lived on, and I had told them that was the road I lived on. They said that we'll just call your parents to see if you can stay the night.
What did they tell you as the days went on, why they were keeping you with them, and what did they tell you about your family?
Well, the first night they had said they called my parents and said it was all right that I stayed the night. The second night they said that they had called them again and said that I could stay another night. Then one of them went out and came back and said that he went to court and got in possession of me and said that I was his.
How did you feel about that when you heard that?
I really forgotten what I felt at that time. It was kind of a shock to me.
Police track down Steven's birth records confirming he is the long-lost Stayner boy. 14 years after his abduction, and over 100 miles from home, Steven Stayner has found freedom. His bold escape has saved Timmy White's life, and finally brought his own nightmare to an end. Late on March 1, 1980, the phone rings at the Steiner home in Merced. Dell and Kay brace for awful news, assuming they've found their son's remains. Instead, a miracle awaits. Steven is alive. The next day, their boy comes home at last. Kay later describes the overwhelming moment. "I just went to pieces when I saw him. I grabbed him and said, 'That's my little Stevie that was stolen from me 7 years ago.'" But amid the joyful reunion, the scars of Steven's trauma lurk below the surface. After 7 years under Parnell's coercive control, returning to normal childhood is a monumental challenge. Steven's captivity has left him stunted developmentally and emotionally. He struggles to bond with his siblings, who now feel like strangers. Steven confides that his father Dal seems hesitant to show physical affection. Their relationship remains strained and distant. At school, curiosity about Steven morphs into cruel taunting.
Once he started school in 9th grade, they followed him. They wanted to see him first day of school.
Steve is a 9th grader at Merced High School's East Campus. We caught up with him in woodshop, last class of the day, where Steve seemed just as removed and oblivious to the media as he's been since last Sunday, the day he entered the media spotlight.
Back then, the schools were not enclosed in fences. Well, you could just walk in off the street and start asking questions.
The science class was okay, but I don't really like science that much.
What do you like? You have any idea what you're interested in at this point? Technical things or academic things?
I like the sports and wood shop. I like to work with wood.
Indications are that his sporadic schooling of the past 7 years has left him well behind his current classmates. He'll get tutoring to catch up.
A lot of other kids envied him or were jealous of the attention that he was getting.
Classmates mock him about the sexual abuse. Steven responds with erratic behavior, joking about his captivity as a defense mechanism. The Stainers long for life to return to how it was before the abduction. But too much has changed. Steven spirals further following the trial of his kidnapper. When Kenneth Parnell receives just 5 years prison time, a light sentence by most standards, it devastates the Steiner family.
Besides buffeting him, the adults who say he's a hero and the kids who are just picking on him mercilessly, he's got to deal with Parnell as well. There he is, sitting in the courtroom, and he's got to point at Ken Parnell.
Ultimately, Kenneth Parnell did face charges of kidnapping and false imprisonment, but he was never tried for sexual assault in this case. In the end, there was not sufficient evidence to prove those charges.
It was outrageous. There was out-and-out fury over the sentence.
I'm angry that he will be back out on the street. I thought laws were to protect the innocent children, and it's not, because he will be out and he possibly will do it again, quite probably.
Steven descends into substance abuse and depression. For the next decade, he floats between jobs and relationships, unable to find stability or escape his trauma. Until a new chapter begins, one that briefly offers hope. In 1985, Steven Stayner marries his high school girlfriend, Jody Edmondson. They welcome 2 children, daughter Ashley and son Steven Jr. Fatherhood provides Steven with newfound purpose. Eager to prevent other families enduring such anguish, Steven begins traveling to schools nationwide to educate students about abduction prevention. He embraces his role as a spokesperson for missing children. In 1989, Steven's story hits TV screens in the form of a highly publicized NBC miniseries entitled, "I Know My First Name is Steven."
It can happen at any time.
Just take him. No!
To any family.
Oh my God.
In 1972, it happened to Steven.
Your new name is Dennis. You must never, ever tell anyone the name he used to have.
For 7 long years,
Can I go home today?
he had the courage to survive the man who took him.
Is that you?
Please. Please let this be true.
A world premiere event based on the true story.
I know my first name is Steven.
Monday.
The movie promises to uplift viewers while raising awareness about child safety. For the production, Steven returns to his hometown of Merced and offers feedback to ensure authenticity. He cameos as a police officer in the final scene, welcoming his character home. The miniseries takes creative liberties at points, dramatizing events for entertainment value. But the attention it brings to Steven's advocacy work seems worth this trade-off. The project fuels Steven's motivation to create change. Tragically, just 4 months after the miniseries airs, Steven's resurgent optimism is cut short. On September 16, 1989, while riding his motorcycle home from work, Steven is hit by a car and killed on impact. After enduring 7 years of captivity, he is dead at 24. Survived by his wife Jody and their 2 young children who will now only know their father through Corin Nemec's fictionalized portrayal. A cruel irony. Steven's story originally ended with his escape and rescue of Timmy White, garnering support from missing children. But his real life concludes in irrevocable tragedy, setting the stage for the next harrowing chapter in the Steiner family's saga.
Before, Steven is killed while riding a motorcycle. His unexpected death another blow to older brother Cary.
This rage is starting to bubble up. Cary has a couple of nervous breakdowns. One was fairly violent.
He stated that he felt like jumping in the truck, driving it through the shop, and killing the boss, and killing everybody in the office, and then torching the place. And that's when I told him, you need to go see a doctor, Cary.
On the morning of February 15, 1999, a housekeeper enters room 509 at the Cedar Lodge in California's Yosemite National Park. Inside, she makes a horrifying find: the bodies of 42-year-old Carol Sund, her 15-year-old daughter Julie, and Julie's friend Silvina Palazzo, 16. The women, visiting from Modesto, have been brutally murdered, bludgeoned and strangled to death.
Park. In February 1999, he sees an opportunity to finally act out his sick fantasy. In one of the furthest hotel rooms at Cedar Lodge are 3 guests: Carol Lund, her 16-year-old daughter Julie, and their friend Silvina Palazzo, visiting from Argentina. Cary knocks on their door. He tells them he's maintenance and needs to fix a leak.
They let me in. I went to the bathroom to check the fan, where I told them the leak probably would be. When I came out of the bathroom, I pulled my gun out, and I told them I wanted the money and the keys to the car.
Horrific cruelty in a landscape known for its natural splendor. Law enforcement launches a massive manhunt, setting up an FBI command center in the national park. But for weeks, the case sees little progress. Then a grim discovery points toward the culprit. In March 1999, Carol Sund's charred car is found abandoned off a remote road, containing 2 bodies identified through dental records as Carol and Silvina.
Their lodge. The remains of 2 bodies were found in the trunk.
I knew from the very beginning that my girl was there. How? I don't know. Don't ask me. Just felt.
Her mother's intuition was sadly correct. It was Silvina in the trunk of that car. Silvina along with Carol Sund.
Then the big mystery was, where's Julie?
Around the same time, an anonymous letter leads authorities to Julie Sund's remains near a reservoir.
Investigators get a break. A letter in the mail with a crude map showing an area about 40 miles from where the burned car was found.
Earlier this afternoon, investigators discovered the body of a homicide victim.
The body of 15-year-old Julie Sund was identified earlier in the week.
Authorities would take 2 half-brothers with violent backgrounds into custody in connection with the murders of the 3 women.
People may have thought the right people were in custody, and they certainly wanted to believe the right people were in custody, but they weren't the right people.
Cary Stayner was still working here at the lodge. He was still living here on the premises. He was still an active member of the community.
With 3 victims now recovered, investigators zero in on suspects with ties to Yosemite. A name from the Cedar Lodge employee registry catches their attention: Cary Stayner. 10 years after Steven Stayner's tragic death, the Steiner family is confronted with unthinkable grief all over again. This time, however, Cary is not a victim, but the primary suspect in a sadistic triple murder. Cary Stayner, 37, moves into the spotlight as the prime suspect in the Sund murders. The handsome, broad-shouldered maintenance man has no violent criminal history, but several chilling facts implicate him. Cary is the last known person to have seen Carol and the girls on the night of February 14, 1999, Valentine's Day. His vehicle was spotted near where Julie Sund's body was found, and when FBI agents inspect his truck, they find hair fibers matching the victims. Under interrogation, Cary invokes his Fifth Amendment rights and asks for a lawyer. With no confession, agents lack enough evidence to hold him for the Sund murders. But Cary remains under 24/7 surveillance as the investigation continues. Tragically, just days later, a female park naturalist named Joie Armstrong goes missing. Officers searching her cabin find signs of a violent struggle and large blood stains. It's clear she has met a violent end. The next day, Cary Stayner fails to show up for work.
didn't really see him as a suspect. He didn't raise alarm bells for anybody.
That summer, Cary finds his next victim, 26-year-old Joey Armstrong, a naturalist working at Yosemite, living on the west side of the park.
I was just over there throwing rocks in the creek, and just after I noticed her walk out again and again, it seemed like she was alone.
He gets out his backpack. He's got a gun, he's got duct tape, he's got a knife. He's standing somewhere in this vicinity, and he's talking to her.
So I pulled out the gun, I put it to her head. She turned around and freaked out. I told her to go inside.
Authorities soon find Joey's body in a stream near her cabin, decapitated.
This was just as grisly a scene as you could possibly imagine.
Unlike the first 3 murders where he left virtually no evidence, he knew that he had left a very easy trail for investigators.
Someone spotted Cary's distinctive car on the road Joey lived on the day she was murdered. Authorities issue an alert to be on the lookout for him.
Authorities set off a manhunt for him yesterday.
FBI agents track him down at a nudist colony where he has checked in under a false name. With Joey Armstrong now missing under suspicious circumstances, authorities arrest Cary for murder. Behind bars, Cary finally admits the truth. He confesses to killing all 3 Sund women in February, providing grisly details about the premeditated murders. Cary also reveals he alone abducted and murdered Joey Armstrong, officially cementing his notoriety as the Yosemite Killer. Cary shows no remorse, blaming his 5-murder impulse on being tormented by violent fantasies since childhood. With his guilt affirmed, prosecutors push for the maximum punishment, the death penalty. As Cary Stayner's capital murder trial nears in 2002, speculation runs rampant about what drove this quiet, nondescript man to unspeakable evil. The defense team pushes a nature versus nurture argument, painting Cary as a victim of childhood trauma and inadequate psychiatric intervention. A tortured young mind shaped by the shadow of his famous kidnapped brother. Cary's lawyers argue that the Stayner parents, consumed with Steven's recovery, neglected Cary's mental health, failing to recognize signs of social dysfunction and provide proper treatment, allowing his antisocial fantasies to metastasize over time into homicidal reality. The prosecution dismisses this tactic as a blatant ploy for sympathy, maintaining Cary received as much care and support as any child could hope for. He alone bears responsibility for his heinous crimes. In the end, the jury unanimously agrees. Cary is found guilty on all 5 capital murder counts and condemned to death. He currently remains on death row at San Quentin Prison, waiting as one of 700+ inmates pending California's next execution. For parents Dell and Kay Stayner, Cary's horrific acts are the final tragic chapter in their family legacy. They lost one son to a predator in the 1970s, and gained another son who became a predator himself. Of Cary's motives, we may never have definitive answers. Perhaps, as is often true of criminals, the roots are too deep, dark and tangled to ever fully untangle. But we can at least properly frame this American horror story, and ensure that hope, not just tragedy, echoes in the Stayner name. The painful saga of Steven and Cary Stayner forces us to confront the rippling impacts of trauma, of how damaged people, when deprived of care, can spread their pain outward onto innocence. It's a lesson in the power of community support, of lifting up those who need it most, before they are led down darker paths. This has been True Crime Legacy. Join us next time as we explore more defining cases that left permanent marks on society's moral fabric. Until then, take care.